Hello and welcome to PMP Live. I'm Alan Watke, an event coordinator with Politics and Prose. Thank you for joining us in this new format in the midst of these unprecedented events. From the pandemic, which forced us all inside our homes, to this worldwide police brutality protests as part of Black Lives Matter that are now compelling us to get back out of them. Throughout all of this, we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. At any time during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to pre-order Nam-nyong his book Friend, on Politics and Prose website. Today, you can ask the authors a question by clicking on the Q&A link, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we want to thank you for being with us today. We are so thankful to our family of loyal customers, keeping our business and our spirits afloat. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome to PMP Live, Dr. Immanuel Kim, the translator of the novel Friend by Nam-nyong Beck. Immanuel is a specialist in North Korean literature and cinema. His research focuses on the changes and development, particularly in the representations of women, sexuality, and memory of North Korean literature from the 60s to present day. His book, A Rewriting Revolution, Women's Sexuality and Memory in North Korean Fiction, explores the complex and dynamic literary culture that has deeply impacted the society. His second book, called Laughing North Koreans, Culture of the Film Industry, is on North Korean comedy films and the ways in which humor has been an integral component of the everyday life. By exploring comedy films and comedians, Dr. Kim looks past the ostensible propaganda and examines the agency of laughter. Joining Dr. Kim in conversation will be Patricia Park, the author of the debut novel Jane, a modern-day interpretation of Jane Eyre set in the New York and Seoul. And she, as well, is an assistant professor at American University. And so, please join me in welcoming to PMP Live, Dr. Immanuel Kim and Patricia Park. Hello.
Hey, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alan, and to Politics and Prose for hosting us.
Thank you.
Immanuel, I'm so jazzed to be talking to you about Friend, and I just can't believe that the last time we spoke, it was in real life. You know, we had lunch in Georgetown like normal people in between teaching classes, and here we are quarantining and talking virtually. But
that's right. Yeah.
But congratulations. I can't wait to talk about this.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. I mean, again, thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting us. And I hope that despite what's going on around us, hopefully this conversation will brighten it up a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So just to give a little bit of a summary of the book, Friend opens with a woman named Soon-hee. She is a singer and a local celebrity, and she's filing for divorce. She's trying to petition for divorce from her factory worker husband. And the judge presiding over the case, Judge Chung, he is investigating their lives, piecing together stories. But the novel is not just a portrait of one failing marriage, but a double portrait, both Soon-hee and Seok-jun, her factory worker husband, and Judge Chung and his own wife, who is a botanist and is often traveling for long stretches of time away from home to serve the state. So I'm just curious, how did you find this novel? And why did you choose it for translation?
Yeah, so I was doing research in North Korean literature, and it was back in 2009, I want to say. I was doing my PhD. I went to South Korea, the National Library, where they house a lot of North Korean literature, literary journals, and other texts as well. And I started from the 1960s. I started reading through short stories and novels here and there. Some were good, some were your typical North Korean, or what you would think is typical North Korean literature. And then I came across the 70s, and the 70s were dreadful to read, right? But there was a particular historical context as to why those were so dreadful.
Yeah.
And then I come across the 1980s, and again, I see sort of the repetition of these patterns of North Korean literature. And I almost threw in the towel and I said, I've had enough. I can't stand this anymore, until I came across Friend. And I thought, wow, what an interesting opening. The opening itself is already different from your typical North Korean literature. The drama is right there, right? I want a divorce. And
I've never heard of divorce in a Korean family, let alone a North Korean family.
Right. And so I got hooked, and a few hours later, I was done with the novel. And I thought, okay, well, this is very different. This is unique, and I need to look into the author a little bit more. And so I started reading all of his short stories and novels. And I've noticed a pattern. He tends to write about family a lot. So I thought, okay, this is the guy to go to, right? And I focused my PhD dissertation around him, and eventually that dissertation became my first book. So that's how I found him. It was almost by chance.
I can't imagine that breath of fresh air sitting in the National Library, like reading through this drudgery of propaganda fiction, and then reading about something that sounds so refreshing and modern. I was hoping you could tell us who is Paek? What's his bio? Position him in the literary landscape, and also you've traveled to North Korea to meet him. So I want to hear all about who this guy is.
Yeah. So he was born in 1948, which is about the same year that my father was born. So he's of that generation, and he fortunately survived the Korean War. Unfortunately, his father didn't, and he grew up with a single mother with two older sisters. And eventually, his mother passed away with a terminal disease, and he ended up living with his sisters. And then he found a job as a teenager in this factory. And one of the characters in the novel is really based on him, right? His experience in the factory. But he loved literature. So in his spare time, he would read and he would experiment with writing. So he did that for many years and submitted one of his short stories to the local newspaper. And they picked him up and they said, look, this is great. And then Pyongyang picked it up and thought, wait, this guy is a potential writer, right? So he got invited to Pyongyang, and that's how he began his career as a writer. Excuse me, my voice.
That's crazy. I mean, and to just contextualize that a little bit more for the Western audience, not just anyone gets to go to Pyongyang, right? It's not like, hey, I'm going to take the Amtrak to DC. You have to be invited. Is it almost like akin to getting a visa? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know the actual process, but you're right. It is, you have to be chosen, right? And you have to be at a certain caliber and recognized as a potential national writer, right? So that's how that's the process. Many have come to Pyongyang to pursue their dreams, but that doesn't mean that they are recognized as a celebrated writer. And Paek was one of the fortunate ones to become one of the celebrated writers.
Wow, that's so great. And in that way, in this regime that we think of as so oppressive, where roles are scripted from birth,
yeah.
In a sense, Paek Nam-nyong, he's proving a kind of a meritocracy that based on the quality of his work, that he was then invited to pursue this other occupation.
Right. Yeah, and so that's pretty common in North Korea.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if you're fortunate enough to be born in Pyongyang and within that elite group, then you sort of have that privilege that no one else really has. And everyone else in the vicinity or in the countryside really has to work hard to get there. And again, not everyone is chosen.
Yeah. Well, I was really curious as I was reading this novel about what the conventions of novel reading are in North Korea. Is it, I don't know, armchair escapism for a North Korean housewife? Or is that imposing too Western a reading on, well, reading? Is novel reading, is it a public experience or a private one? Is it for the masses or is it for the rarefied elite? Could you contextualize this?
Yeah, these are really good questions. So there's a scholar by the name of Sonia Rang. And when she visited North Korea in the 80s, she noticed that everyone was reading. Right? Along the streets, bus stop, restaurants, anywhere that she went, she found people reading. And when I visited North Korea in 2015, An elevator girl, she must have been a teenager or something. All she does is push buttons to take us to the floor that we want to go to. She was reading a novel, and we stepped into inside the elevator, and she said, "Which floor?" I said, "Fourth floor." She pushed 4, and she kept on reading. I was like, are you doing your job or what? I mean, what's going on here? Why are you reading while you're on the job? But I noticed that she was really immersed in the novel. And I looked at the novel, and I actually read that novel. So I said, "Oh, do you like that?" And she was like, "Oh, it's a great story." But what I've noticed in 2015 is, yes, people are reading, but they're reading from their mobile phones.
Oh.
So unlike Sonia Rang's experience of seeing all these North Koreans read with physical books or newspaper or whatever they have in their hands, the time I went in 2015, they were looking at their phones. So there's a shift that we see. Yeah.
But is there like a designated list from the DPRK government? This is what you're allowed to read, or I mean, I guess anything that's off topic or isn't even allowed publication. How do people find their reading choices?
Right. So there are recommended books for the people to read, and those kind of novels I tend to stay away from. Okay. Because it's pretty obvious what the party wants the people to read. Now, that's not to say that Paek's novel is dissident writing. This is far from it, right? This is state-sanctioned, state-supported, and he's a state employee. So he's not going to write anything that is aberrant to what we would consider to be dissident writing. This is along the lines of any writers in North Korea, right? And the ones that people are reading on the streets, those aren't dissident writings either. They're all state-sanctioned writing, or state-supported writing. So, I can't answer the question if whether they're reading dissident writings or not.
Then who do you think would be the ideal audience for Friend? Is it across the ages, or is it is it like the Gothic novel in its heyday where it was, read by a certain gender, or is it just open to all, the way that the philosophy of the government is?
Yeah. So the demographics is really hard to gauge at this point and measure, unless North Korea opens itself up and allows us to.
That's gonna happen like anything.
Yeah, so it's really hard to measure the demographics. So there's an interesting anecdote, right? So Paek is in a bus, and he notices a young woman in front of him reading Friend, and the cover is completely tattered, right? And the pages are falling apart. And he wanted that copy because that was a verification to him, a validation that people are reading his novel and that the novel is circulating around North Korea. And so he wanted that novel as a souvenir. So he approached the woman and said, "Look, I will get you a new copy if you give me yours right now." Now, from his perspective, again, he wanted that as a souvenir. But from her perspective, she's thinking, who is this crazy old man asking me for this novel, right? And so she's like, no. And she stepped off the bus, but kept her head buried in the novel. And to me, that's a very interesting story because unlike capitalist countries or here in the United States or anywhere else, where there's a certain measurement of how books are selling and what kind of people are reading the novels, in North Korea, it's not like that. So it's very difficult to gauge that. So the way you know that a novel is doing well among the people is by looking at the cover of the novel.
That's so bad. Yeah, there's no like hitting refresh on your Amazon page to see like your rankings going up.
Right.
And that's such what a wonderful story. And that's such a fiction writerly detail too, to note that.
Right.
So Immanuel, the cynic in me has got to ask, Paek is a state-sanctioned writer, right? It's not like he was a state-sanctioned writer and then left. He's writing within these walls. How much of this novel is peddling the Kool-Aid?
Yeah. These are tough questions, right? Well, number one, we have to say officially that he is a mouthpiece of the party. That's the official way to look at it, right? But in all the years I've been doing research in North Korean literature, I realized that, and speaking with some of the writers and meeting Paek himself, there seems to be a different society, a different world, that is very different from the way we understand North Korea. So yes, they are writing politicized stories, and they can't really stray far from this kind of prescribed narrative. And when you read Friend, you're going to see that. You're going to see this kind of prescribed narrative, and oh, here we go again. Here's propaganda again. And one thing we have to understand is we can't. The writers cannot stray from that. So the do's and don'ts. Definitely, the don'ts are: don't criticize the state, don't criticize the leaders, and don't criticize the country. Be nationalistic. So you're going to see that in this novel, right? It's heavy nationalism. Now, as long as you don't do the don'ts, you're free to do other things, right? So you can express social criticism. You can write about certain individuals that you want to criticize and really get at. And I think a lot of readers enjoy that kind of, in between the lines reading and criticizing this social condition at the during this time. I think they enjoy that aspect. I'm not sure if they necessarily buy into the typical propaganda narrative. I think they've had enough of that.
I went to some, I can't remember which North Korean scholar I was talking to, but he summed it up as people go along to get along. And I'm glad to hear you say that people maybe have had enough of that propaganda, or that they're maybe seeing between the lines.
Well, that's really interesting because Kim Jong-il himself, in the late 70s and 80s, asked the artists, so filmmakers, writers, to really get past and beyond what they've been writing and producing all these years. He wanted all these cultural products to compete on the international stage. So for film, there was a huge revival and sort of a renaissance moment in the 80s. And again, literature, a friend written in the 80s, experienced that kind of wave as well. So there was a glimmer of hope in the 80s where filmmakers and writers were able to experiment and push the limits a little bit further than what they've done in the past.
Yeah, and for you as a scholar, that again must have been like the hallelujah
yes.
moment. Like,
absolutely,
joy.
absolutely. Yeah.
What I found so fascinating, the most fascinating parts of the novel were these little kind of quotidian nuggets that Paek drops in, which are just throwaway, I would imagine, for the common reader. But for me, I was like, wait, tell me more. Like, there was that moment where a character walks by a pub that has like neon green flashing lights that says fine liquors. And then I started to think, wait, do they have pubs? A. B, they have neon lights? C, are people even allowed to traverse freely and pop into a pub and have happy hour and then go home? And this, I wondered if there are other moments like that surprised you, and what might be surprising for the Western reader.
Yeah, so that moment where that one character is heading toward the pub, so there are a lot of pubs in North Korea. Not the same kind of pub that we would imagine, like the ones you see in England or here in the United States, but certainly restaurants that have bars, and there are a lot of them. So and there is somewhat of a drinking culture in North Korea as well, and they do like to drink, much like the South Koreans. So it's not entirely unusual. What is unusual is the fact that that character that you're referring to is an alcoholic. So that kind of sort of admission of alcoholism in North Korea was rather interesting to me. That a writer would actually write that and admit that there is some kind of problem in the society. Yeah. Other moments actually throughout the novel, there are these quotidian moments. For example, walking along the streets, meeting friends, having these casual conversations about marriage and gossiping, right? There's a lot of gossiping in this novel.
I love the women talking about like, oh, these youngsters, they're only going for the looks these days.
That's right. And if I can actually expound a little more on that. So there's a scene where the judge, this was in his prime, and when he was young, he just got married, and they have this huge reception, and one of his buddies gets up and starts talking about the party, right, and how love should be party oriented. You should direct your relationship to the party, the typical narrative. But what Paek does really craftily is he doesn't complete that speech. In other novels, the speaker would complete that speech because you're talking about the party, right? You have to acknowledge the party. But Paek doesn't. He kind of drifts off, right? And it's almost like a camera that pans to the crowd, and the crowd is restless, right? I love that scene, right? So the crowd is so restless. Come on, get your speech over with, right? I want to eat. I want to drink. And once the speech is over, the people just start partying, drinking, and so forth. And the women there are talking about, my daughter, she's, over the hill. She's at that age of, needing to get married, but she can't seem to get a boyfriend or whatnot. And that kind of quotidian kind of conversation is just wonderful to read.
Oh my God, Immanuel, I feel like we have to go to there. Would you be up for reading that little moment?
Yeah.
92?
Page 92, yes.
We could do it as a dialogue. We could exchange. You could be person one, I could be person two.
Right. So it says, as the hours passed, the topic of the bride and groom slowly faded. Like nobody cares about the bride and groom anymore. The elderly people sitting around the tables began to share their personal stories of women, love, and marriage. Vulgar words were exchanged among the elders, whose experiences in life provided deep and honest lessons for one another. And here's one of the women. I don't care what other people say. Women needs to be very strong in the family. And the other woman says, that's right. My husband, don't even get me started. I married him because he was big, thinking that he had something great in him, but I realized he's a good for nothing. And so forth. Then the conversation just keeps going on.
I love it. You just brought in the sass right there.
Right.
Attitude.
And you know what? North Korean women have that kind of sassy attitude. And so it was just really refreshing to read that because you don't normally see this in other North Korean literature.
That's great. And actually that segues really well to a big question I had about translation and the challenges of translating a novel like this. When we talk about translation, we talk about literal versus cultural translation. How much do you unpack all of the pop culture or political resonances? I'm thinking, in the American expression, that's hot. Do you translate that as the temperature is very warm? Or do you translate it as like, this catchphrase was coined by Paris Hilton in the 2000 reality TV show, The Simple Life? I thought about that moment in the novel where it felt like a throwaway line or throwaway moment. There was a guy being put on trial for the felony of using an electric blanket.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's just another day in the life in America. Use an electric blanket, big deal. But this was considered a huge crime against the state because electricity is a public good. And it was, in Paek's words, a crime of selfishness and greed. And again, these are one of these moments that just opened my eyes to thinking, whoa, we are not in this world. We are aliens from America reading a novel about North Koreans by North Koreans for North Koreans. What gets lost? What gets lost in translation? What's happening there? And I'll piggyback that too into, we have some questions about translation. So I'll start to unpack these as you go on with your fine self.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm not a trained translator. I wish I were. I'm sure I would have done a better job with this novel. I'm just a scholar who just fell in love with this novel, and I realized I needed to do, I needed to translate this novel for practical sake, right? So because of my research and because I need to teach this novel. So there were many moments throughout this whole translation process where I found, oh, I'm stuck. What do I do? How do I get out of this? How do I interpret this? How do I, do I do literals? In some moments, I do literal because, you know, some lines are very straightforward, right? And some lines are very understandable, you know, if it's straightforward. Other ones are a little bit tricky, right? So to give you an example, in many North Korean fiction, there are moments where the other person does not respond, and all it has in the original is ... meaning that person is thinking about something, right? Is thinking about something, or it just so surprised, can't answer it, and so forth. So I struggled with that, right? Do I keep it as ... Would my readers understand what the ... means? I'm sure they would, but I'm just, you know, I asked another translator, a friend of mine, and she said, you know what, sometimes you have to fill in the blank, right? And you have to understand and really get into the head of the character and express that in your words. So I started doing that. And yeah, so those were, you know, some of the struggles that I've had. In terms of cultural translation, let me tell you, I didn't, to be honest with you, I didn't know what a lathe operator was. So
I didn't either. I had to look that up.
I had to Google that, right? I was like, what in the world?
How do you even pronounce it? Yeah.
Yeah, what in the world is a lathe operator? And so I've noticed that in many North Korean literature, that is a common occupation, right? Oh. Because many people work in the factories and many people operate these huge machines. So a lathe operator is pretty common, among other ones, right? So those were really hard. You know, would my readers understand? I'm sure, are they gonna Google what lathe operator is, right? And the ones that are really difficult for me to translate are the ranks, the social rank, right? So what position are you in society? Are you a vice chairman? You know, are you a manager? Are you a supervisor? These are words that are commonly used in North Korean literature and society, but they don't necessarily translate over quite well because North Korea has this kind of militaristic society built in, this culture built into the society, that they use these words commonly, right? It's like struggles, revolution. They use that on a daily basis. But for us, we don't use that on a daily basis, right? So if I say like, oh, you know, if the original says, oh, this was a struggle to do this, we think of, oh, it was a difficulty doing this. But for them, it's revolution. It's something that I have to do and overcome. So, you know, translating that kind of military culture, it was a little bit of a struggle. Yeah.
Yeah, like otherwise common words are latent with this political undertone. And those dreamy 3 dots, the quote ... when I've encountered that in Korean literature, I'm like, F this, I'm bringing this into American literature. And I added that in my first novel, and my editor made me cut it. And I'm like, no, this is the one bridge. This is like the one thing I'm gonna fight for. It doesn't make sense. It confuses all of my English language readers. Yeah. But I think this is the ultimate test of translatability, when we learn something new about that culture, and then how much do you import those conventions of another literature. I want to invite, well, we actually have 3 questions right now about translation, and I'm hoping I can kind of fold them into a macro question.
Sure.
And also, as a side note, I invite all of you listeners out there to type up your questions as we go. We will have some time at the end, but if your question makes sense as we're talking, I'll try to fold that in. But I'm going to give shout outs to Heather Hurley, Ash Bolas, and Jimena Sanchez. Sorry if I mispronounced. Are there any special considerations when translating something written by a North Korean versus a South Korean? And then we have questions about the publishing process, which, you know, I'll get to in a bit. But let me see. Fascinating.
Yes, so if I could address that really quickly. North Koreans use different words than South Koreans. So the country's been divided for over 70 years now. And the North Koreans have come up with their, you know, language evolves, right? So the North Koreans have come up with their own words to describe certain things. Their prose is very different from the South Koreans. So, I had a very difficult time understanding some of the words. So I would look up this South Korean dictionary, online dictionary, and they have a section, when you type in the word, they have a section that says, parentheses, North Korea. So then they would describe, so in North Korea, this is what it means. So in other words, it's sometimes it's confusing for even South Koreans to read a North Korean novel, because what they thought this word meant, it means something else in North Korea. So I had to rely heavily on this online dictionary and try to understand, the culture of North Korea, because the words are very different. So there's that. Yeah.
That's like if you went to the OED and you looked up a word and it's like parentheses New Yorkese, or like,
that's right,
Los Angelinos. But and there's another layer for you, because you're a California boy. You're born and bred here. So then you're translating. I mean, I know you're completely fluent in Korean, but you grew up here. So then there's that other layer too.
Absolutely.
Jeez.
It's very, very difficult. Yeah.
So there are two questions about the publishing process. Was it difficult to find a publisher to get behind this project? Any pushback around the phrasing as you're working on this? New reflections on culture. And then similarly, was it difficult for the author? Did the author have concerns about this work being translated and being accessible in other languages, or maybe he was excited by this? So talk us through the publishing process a bit.
Right. So I approached maybe 2 publishers before Columbia, and they were a small time publishing company, and they expressed interest, but for some reason it just didn't work out. And Columbia just really picked it up, and I really appreciated what Columbia has done for me in the whole process of editing the book and really trying to get this book known and the word out to the people. I was blessed to have Columbia really pick this up. In terms of Paek, so when I went to go see him in 2015, At that point, I didn't have any contract with Columbia. I was just still in the search mode for a publishing company. But I told Paek that, hey, look, I've translated your novel and I'm looking for a publisher. Are you okay with me publishing or translating your novel? And he was very open to it.
Well, let's bear in mind, this is a guy who runs after a woman on the bus, being like, "Oh my God, you're reading a dog."
Yeah. Absolutely. You know what? And first of all, this novel was reprinted in South Korea in 1992.
Holy cow!
So South Koreans already knew about this novel, and then a French publisher picked it up. 2004. I can't remember. No, probably a little later. I can't remember.
Selfie as we talk.
Right. So it was published in France as well, and then now it's the English translation. But yeah, Paek was very excited that I wanted to translate this novel, and I told him, look, there are some strange moments in the novel where it doesn't make sense. Can you explain to me why there are some gaps here? And he didn't answer that question because my guide, my minder, was also in the room. And then I noticed, so in the original, there are gaps. And this weird kind of transition from this scene to another one. And it was just very abrupt and incoherent. So I had to ask him, but he didn't answer the question. So then I told him, sort of recognizing that he's struggling to answer this question. I said, look, I'm going to have to fill in some of the gaps here. Right? And he looked at me and said, you, as a translator, you do whatever you want to do. The novel is out of my hands now.
Wow.
So I said, really?
What a blessing.
Yeah, well, if you're gonna give me that kind of liberty, So yeah, I had to really fill in some of the gaps that were in the narrative. And I told him, and of course I had to get his blessing. Not only that, we sat and we had to go through every character and really get inside the head of each character, right? And so that way the narrative flows better. So yeah, I had to go through that process with him.
Oh yeah, what's he like in person? Is he watching his every word because there are minders everywhere? Is he like, let's go get a drink? I mean, I'm even fascinated how you were even able to travel. I know you've traveled a few times, and but how this was even able to happen, and what he's like IRL.
Yeah, so he is, I don't know, he's like your typical 70-year-old man. He loves to talk. I guess writers just like to talk. I throw out one question and all he does is just ramble on and on. Despite the fact that my minder was sitting there. I had lunch, dinner with him. We also played table tennis, and he is great. He is a great player, right? He's just a lot of fun to be with, right? And there were so many other things that we shared that I can't share publicly because I promised that I would keep it somewhat discreet. But yes, absolutely fascinating and really opened my eyes to the world of the literary culture in North Korea.
Wow. Well, it's so wonderful to be able to have that liberty and the blessing of the writer to trust that we are going to take their baby, their work, and do justice to it. So that's so rad that you were able to meet and have that moment together. I invite readers to continue to type in your questions. Thank you for the 3 who've done that, and please type them up and I'll address them as we go along. But Immanuel, I was wondering, I'm interested in humor, and your second book, Laughing North Koreans, which I'm sorry, you must have heard this over and over, but that must be an oxymoron, or people think Laughing North Koreans is an oxymoron. And we've talked, in our conversations about the role of humor and how you've used humor to kind of break down, certain the North Koreans you've met, or you've used that as a kind of touchstone. And I've noticed that there were moments of that as well. I wondered if, so long as it's not too reductivist, if you wanted to talk kind of generally about humor, you could talk about it specifically and how it plays out in Friend. I want to hear your thoughts on all things funny.
Yeah, so let me tell you, North Koreans are funny, right? You give them a few drinks and they will start telling you some interesting jokes, right? But aside from that, right, I found humor even in literature, not just in Friend, but back in the 60s, 70s literature. There are little nuggets of humor that just really brightens up the whole story. And it's not like your ha fall on the ground funny, but certainly the situation is humorous, right? So that's what a lot of North Koreans tend to do. The situation and the context is really funny, and I could see myself in it. I've done that as well, so I find that funny. For example, in Friend, there's this one scene where the main character, Seok-chun, the husband, meets Suni, the potential wife, the future wife, for the first time, and he just falls in love with her, right? And just cannot get her out of his mind. And he decides to write a letter to her, somewhat of a love letter, but he doesn't want it to sound like a love letter because then that sounds cheesy because he's a macho man, right? So he doesn't want to be too overly sentimental and so forth. So he's sprawled on the ground and he's on the floor and he's writing a letter, and he's crossing out words here that is too maybe flowery. He's checking his grammar over and over again because he doesn't want her to think that he's stupid. So he's going through many, many revisions. And in the end, he just crumbles up the paper because it's just a love letter. And that's exactly something that he did not want to write. And I sort of remember my high school days when there was a girl that I liked, and I would write a note and I would have to rewrite that note over and over again because I wanted to sound perfect. So when I read that scene, I was just like, wow, I totally relate, right? There's another one where the judge, when he was courting his future wife, she was heading back home, and she's at the train station on the platform, and he rushes over to her, and she's like, "Whoa, what are you doing here?" He's like, "Well, I came to see you." And she's like, "Well, you know what? I don't want to deal with this right now. I got to go back home." He's like, "That's fine. Let me help you with your luggage on the train." So he helps her, and they get on. But there's this awkward moment where, okay, so do I shake her hand and say, "Good travels, my friend"? Do I call her comrade? Do I call her, what do I call her? And do I give her a hug? No. Hug is a little too much, right? So there's this awkward moment, and I find that absolutely funny, right? And so he wants to get away from this awkward moment. So he's like, "Okay, well, I'm going to get off the train now." And she's like, yeah. We'll see you later. So he gets off the train, and he still wants to say goodbye to her, and he's standing on the platform, and he's waving to her goodbye, and she's waving back, right? But the train doesn't leave, right? The train doesn't leave, right? So they're waving, and oh, now it's a little awkward. So he buries his hand deep in his pockets, right? And kind of looks away and so forth. To me, this is so funny, right? There are many moments like that throughout the novel, right? And you wouldn't expect that. But yeah, these are very relatable moments. And in cinema as well, there's a whole culture of comedy films that are not necessarily crass humor, like, for example, Dumb and Dumber, maybe. There isn't like that, or there aren't too many slapstick comedy that we're very familiar with. But there are situational humor, right? So, I find it to be absolutely funny. And my parents, my parents, who are staunch anti-North Koreans, right? When I showed them a few comedy films from the 70s, they thought it was hilarious because they grew up in that period, right? And they thought it was just absolutely hilarious. So yeah, North Koreans have a great sense of humor. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think this folds in well. We have a question from Julia Garbani, and I ask all the viewers out there to type in your questions, and we'll answer them as we go. She was very struck by the character of the judge's wife, of Unok. And is it common in North Korean novels to see depictions of such independent women or husbands that are so supportive of their wives' careers? Does this reflect some specific policy of the DPRK regime regarding women in the workforce? Before we jump into that question, I actually wondered if you could just read one or two lines from that excerpt we had mentioned, where Unok, who is the wife of Judge Chung, they're in their courtship, and they're kind of having this little moment together on page 87. If we could start with Comrade Jinwoo, and then just go until a little bit to the next page, and then we can fold in this question.
Right. So to provide a little context, the judge was pursuing Unok.
The woman he was endlessly waving to on the train, and then having that awkward like.
Right. And he's pursuing her, and Unok is really distancing herself from him, and rejected him a few times. But after some time, she sort of caved in, and they decided to get married. And now this is them out doing a little stroll along the park, and they're sitting there, and she says, "Comrade Jinwoo, will you love me like this even after we get married?" And the judge says, "Of course I will." And she says, "For the rest of your life?" And they're at that point, they're tightly holding their hands together. And Unok says, "At times I'm afraid of you." And the judge says, "Why?" "Well, because you're a judge." And the judge says, "Well, didn't you study a bit of law yourself?" And she says, "What good is that? It was just a hobby for me. But you're an actual judge. I'm afraid that you'll treat our family like defendants, prosecuting us with the law." And at this point, Unok imitates the gestures and the tone of a judge. "According to the code of civil procedure on page so-and-so, in paragraph so-and-so, the complaining wife is as the following," and so forth.
Oh my.
Right. And it's really funny because the judge says, "Well, no matter how much I love you, if you break the law, I will prosecute you." And so, yeah, there's this humorous exchange between them, and it's cute. But let me tell you, Unok is by far my favorite character in the novel, simply because she only appears at the end of the novel, only to leave again for her project and her research. And this is very unusual in North Korean literature. Women working in North Korean literature is not unusual. Right? This whole idea of gender equality, although that's very questionable, this facade, this ostensible gender equality is in the fiction, and you see women going out to work and so forth. But what Eun-ok does is very interesting, and that is she doesn't really do any of the housework. She doesn't do any of the so-called motherly or what a wife is expected to do in fiction. And remember, literature has to be a reflection of society, yes, but on the other hand, it's supposed to educate the society and sort of project this image of a wholesome family, right? What a wife should do, what a husband should do, right? And Eun-ok just betrays all of that. And she only appears at the end of the novel. And she's been away for like 20 days, by the way. She comes back and she appears for only like a couple days. And she says, by the way, I have to go back on my research trip. So she's hardly at home. And that kind of characterization was so refreshing to me, right? This kind of independent woman. Is she working for the state? Maybe. We can probably see it like that. But actually, in the judge's recollection of her, she's really just looking out for her own village. Right? She cares so much about her village. And there's a sense that the state has betrayed that village. The state supported other villages and provided food, fruit and vegetables, accessible clean water. But for her village, which is in the mountains, you can't grow crops. There's no clean water. So there's sort of this sentiment of betrayal from the state. And that is just wonderful. I find her to be an exquisite character and something that is very and highly unusual in North Korean literature.
Yeah, and those brief moments, I mean, she is off stage for the vast majority of the novel, or talked about in memories and flashback. But when she does appear, there is such a refreshingness, and even that sarcasm, she zings him,
Yeah.
But then he lays down the law literally. And I think I can see why you're drawn to a character like her, and actually the two main female characters, both Eun-ok and Sun-hee, who's the singer filing for divorce. These are both career-minded women. I don't know if that's the right way of phrasing it, but they have their professions. And I can see how this dovetails too with, your first scholarly work, Rewriting Revolution, Women, Sexuality, and Memory in North Korean Fiction. So you're very interested in these questions about women and their role. And this novel too is, I was fascinated by the role of women and their duties domestically as well as to the state and that conflict that arises.
Absolutely. So what I've noticed was some of the early works in the early 1960s showed this very independent woman who would talk back to her husband and so forth. But toward the late 60s and well into the 70s, there is this whole movement of family revolution that projected this image of a good housewife, a good mother, right? And of course, the two characters that the state and party projected were the mother of Kim Il-sung and the first wife of Kim Il-sung. So those two women were the ideal images of what an ideal wife and a mother would be. So literature really reflected that, right? And I got so bored of that. I'm like, wow, not only is this like beyond sexist, right? Like what world are we living in, kind of, right? And I was really disappointed with that kind of shift in the portrayal of women. But come the mid to late 80s, we get this refreshing look of women and characterization, and it was just wonderful, right? That's why I saw that early 1960s women, independent women, And then there's this huge period of obedient housewife and woman. And then we see this kind of liberal women as well in the late 80s. It made a nice kind of circle for me.
Yeah, for sure. This question comes from Michaela Cropsey. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing. As I come from a former communist country, and I do know how the censure works, I'm wondering whether the novel reflects the communist ideology, or is it more subtle and could get around the censure? Any bad consequences for the writer? How is it for a writer under the dictatorship?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think if Paek had written this in the 1970s, I think it would have been censored a lot more than in the late 80s. Again, we have to look at the historical context of North Korea. In the 80s, North Korea was opening itself up, right? Relaxing the writers. In fact, the North Korean writers were able to read South Korean literature and European literature as well. So when I asked Paek, what were some of the novels that really made an impact in your life? And it was Jane Eyre, right? And
Airhead.
yeah, it was Jane Eyre. And so, like, for me, Suni, the main character, sort of has that kind of Jane Eyre-ish feel and vibe. Maybe not exactly like Jane Eyre, but certainly that kind of sassiness, attitude can really tap into that Victorian portrayal of Jane Eyre. He also really enjoyed Les Mis, right? Victor Hugo's Les Mis. And other literary works. And in my interview with him, he lists off several novels, European novels that he enjoyed. But again, the context is important. The 80s was a moment where North Korea wanted to open itself up to the international stage. So they couldn't continue writing the style that they had been writing since the 60s and 70s. They had to sort of change it, right? And Friend was just one of them. Wow. So yeah, I mean, I believe there was a lot of censorship going on, certain lines that Paek had to take out. And that's why I mentioned to him, look, I see a little bit of discrepancy here. I see a little gap, right? And again, he didn't answer, but I can sense that, that he understood what I was talking about. Sure, I think there's that level going on in North Korea even to today. But in terms of motif and the theme of the novel, I think the 80s was very, a little bit more open to differences, yeah.
That's great. We have about 5 minutes left, so I see that we have two last questions. This is from Chris Davey. Does Paek have any other novels that interest you for translation? Any other works?
Yeah, so he has written a lot of short stories, which I find to be fascinating and great. And they're all family oriented, right? And then he has other novels, lengthy novels, that talk about the great leaders. And those I do not want to translate. So the short stories, yes, there are many good ones. And a friend of mine and I, we're trying to compile an anthology, a collection of short stories, and one of Paek's short stories is in that collection. I'll tell you something really interesting. So it was one of those days, so I spent 3 days with Paek, and I forget which day it was, but I asked him, listen, let's go to the bookstore. Let's go to the local bookstore. And can you tell me which writers you would recommend me reading? And so we went to the local bookstore. And we're going through, and these are really contemporary current writers, right? And he's going through the books and he goes, he sucks. She really sucks. Oh, that novel.
Throwing shade all over.
Right. I was just like, wow, because, he's a veteran writer. He's of age. He's been in that system for a very long time. And a lot of the writers at the bookstore were up and coming writers, right? But he just outright dismissed those writers, right? And I was thinking, okay, so stay away from him, definitely stay away from her, definitely stay away from him, kind of a thing, right? So, yeah, it was really, really fascinating for me to spend like hours with him at the bookstore, right? And he did pick out like one or two novels, and they were okay, right? I'm not going to say they were great, but again, I think for him, the new generation of writers, man, they have a long way to go, right? Kind of a thing, right? Yeah.
Well, he paid his dues, I guess, and yeah. So I think this is our last question. What is a book that it's actually for both of us. What's a book we've read we've read recently that we would recommend? Immanuel, why don't you go first?
Yeah, well, recently I just been, reading a lot of North Korean short stories because again, I'm compiling a collection of short stories, translating all these short stories for the English readers. So yeah, I've been really immersed in North Korean short stories again. A book that I do want to read, I'm not sure, I'm really torn about this one, is John Bolton's up and coming book. I'm torn because again, I want to read about what's happening inside the White House, but do I really want to? I mean, is it going to be really that new? Something that I don't know already? But then again, John Bolton, he wasn't very nice to the Koreans, both North Koreans and South Koreans. So I'm not sure if I want to support him too much. So I'm torn. I'm really torn. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
Oh, there's a great cartoon. I think it was a New Yorker cartoon where it showed a large picture of a book that said, "What I saw in the White House," and then this tiny little book, "What I Did About It."
Yeah.
So I love that contrast. Whatever. I just this morning finished Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. I guess I'm a few years late on that game, but I'm very curious about, I think the best literature, fiction or nonfiction, transports us to experiences that are so different from our own. Like Friend, everyday people living their everyday lives. That happens to be in the DPRK, but with Hillbilly Elegy, I am curious. I want to know how the white working poor in the Rust Belt, what their stories are, how they've come to shape their beliefs. So I just finished that, and also in a bit of escapism, Good Husbandry by Kristen Kimball. It's a memoir. Yeah, I loved her first book, The Dirty Life, and she is like a former journalist who left New York and her urbane life to become a farmer in upstate New York, and all of the struggles that she deals with. It's been helping me cope in these times. Great. Any last words, Immanuel, for us?
I'm gonna have to give a little shout out to my editor, Christine Dunbar. Man, she's been awesome, right? She knows I'm not a translator and I'm terrible with my prose, and she's wonderful, right? And it was a real tiresome effort on her part. I think she must have been like, "Oh my God, this guy just doesn't get it." But man, I tell you, she was so patient with me, and she really helped me through that whole process. So this is a shout out to her. This would not have happened without her help. So I'm really grateful to her.
That's amazing. And I'm going to remind, I guess this is where Alan, you can jump in.
Oh yeah, no, you're good. Go ahead and yeah.
No, I didn't know who had to do the obligatory plug,
right.
Immanuel's work.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you both so much for being here in this fantastic conversation on just North Korean literature and that translation process. It was great conversation. Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much, Alan. And this was a pleasure, man.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everyone for being here and joining this and your wonderful questions. And it's programming like this and your patronage that is keeping us afloat. I do want to remind you that Nam-nyong Baek's book, Friend, there is a link for that right there in the chat. It takes you straight to Politics and Prose's website. As well as Patricia Park's book, Re Jane, is right there as well. So you can purchase them both together. And also check out our website for all of our upcoming events. We have a whole slew of them. On Tuesday, June 23rd, Roddy Doyle discusses his novel Love as part of the Dublin Voices series. And then on Friday, June 26th at 7, anti-poverty activist and author Wes Moore discusses his newest book, 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City, with journalist Michelle Norris. So please look into those. And thank you again, Immanuel and Patricia. It's just fantastic to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
All right. And thank you all kindly for being here, and stay well read.